Thanks. Thank you very much, Dana. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be moderating this session with Professor Chandra, who has been different things to different young economists over the last few years, a mentor, a joint author, PhD advisor for many people, and I've had the great pleasure of interacting with him and getting his guidance and wise counsel, particularly because of, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that you're not a typical academic economist. You talk to businesses, you talk to CEOs, and you understand what's going through their mind and then relate it to their work. So, Professor Chandra, I have a couple of questions of my own, but I'm going to try and link it to some of the questions that folks have been posting on Slido. One of the things that might be on the minds of a lot of people right now, particularly because you ended on a positive note, that some of the factors that were good preconditions for Sri Lanka back then are still there today. One of the questions that might be on the minds of a lot of us is, so does Sri Lanka still have a chance, and if so, in what areas in this global production networks arena, particularly given that a lot of countries are doing a lot of exciting things on their reforms. We are a relative latecomer on the reform party bus. We are also in a global economic era where we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, the second machine age, and so on, where greater automation, all of that is also happening. So these global production networks, the nature of it is changing hugely. So for a latecomer like ours, amidst others who are doing a lot of exciting things, do we still have a chance? Are those preconditions still enough for Sri Lanka to get a piece of the action?
It's a very important and interesting question. Actually, I had a slide addressing this. Now, say, global production sharing is an evolving phenomenon, right? And again, different countries take part in the process at different stages, depending on their nature of the resource economy. Say, China, even though people think that China is high-tech, China is doing very labor-intensive activities. Electronics look high-tech, but when it comes to electronic assembly, it's a basically labor-intensive thing. When Chinese wages are increasing, naturally, other countries will benefit in joining the process. And again, as I mentioned before, wages are again not the only precondition. There are other factors, the trainability of the worker. Actually, you may not believe, but many investors whom I have talked to talk very highly about the ability of Sri Lankan workers to learn. Now in Bangladesh, to train a machinist on a jockey machine, I have interviewed firm, they take 3 to 6 months. A girl going to a garment factory here learned this within 3 weeks, simply because of the primary education. Say the labor force is 100% literate, right? Their education level is around year 10 education, then very easy to train them. I talked to this engineer, 80 years old. He has a love for Sri Lanka. He said, when you look at the eye of a Sri Lankan and another person, you can make a difference. Our eyes are shining. I think we don't understand it. Even with this trouble, during the height of the war period, he came and set up a plan to produce the time measurement and weighing component of baby incubator. Baby incubator, when a child is born, he is kept in an incubator for a while. The most high-tech component of that incubator is produced by a Sri Lankan company. The engineer came here because of our trainable labor. I think everywhere ministers and everybody, they talk about lack of human capital. I don't believe it. And the real manufacturers who are doing world-class work, they don't believe it in either. The company called Stickline, initially they imported machine to produce elastic from Switzerland. A lathe maker here improved that machine. Earlier the machine could produce 2 lines of elastic. He developed it to produce 6 lines, right? Now, Timotheus Plendevin, the managing director here, he told me that when the Swiss people come there, they would not allow them to enter the factory because they will steal our technology. Then he said, you are an academic, I know you are not going to steal. He showed me the machine. We have this skill, we have to tell these stories to the international community and then promote investment. We are pessimists, that's why we are not doing it.
Continuing on this, on your line, Professor, about pessimism or at least skepticism, one of the biggest stories shaping the economic policy debate this year is about trade liberalization. You showed us that we've slipped on that. I think one of the papers, early papers that you wrote, you cited work by Purcell and Asan that showed the effective protection rates have doubled. I think work by the World Bank also. There was a bit of a scary graph that showed that Sri Lanka today, if you look along the axis of trade as a percentage of GDP, so how much of our economy is running on exports and imports, and on the other axis, how much of it is running on private investment versus public. In 2013, we were closer to 1970, scarily close to 1970 in terms of trade, in openness to international trade, and also the fact that growth was being driven by public investment. So very clearly, Sri Lanka has slipped back on trade liberalization. This year, we're hearing a lot about new trade agreements, trade liberalization, hopefully more broadly, but at least looking at several comprehensive agreements with India, with Singapore, with China, potentially with Japan, Thailand, and Turkey later on. And it's got a fair number of people worried. What is your take on Sri Lanka's trade liberalization journey right now and moving forward in the next few years? What are some of the things that Sri Lanka should really be looking at to reverse some of the trends that you talked about earlier? And also, what would you say to those folks who are worried about trade liberalization? And we're talking about the ETCA with India and all of that as well.
That's actually, I have written made article on this issue in the journal called World Economy. You have seen it. It is true. I mean, that's what I said. We achieved a lot through trade liberalization, but there has been policy backslide from about early 2000. Naturally, we have rectified. That's one of the points I made. Having said that, I have to make one clarification. Now, thanks to the BOI system set up in the 70s, still export-oriented firms, existing export-oriented firms operate under a virtual duty-free regime. When they want to import intermediate inputs, they can import them duty-free. That is one of the continuing strengths. But the thing is, as you correctly said, that the effective rate of protection, that means protection given to industries not only by end product tariff, but also lower intermediate good tariff. I have been calculating effective rate of protection for Sri Lankan manufacturing. It is very high in certain sectors. And there is no economic logic because these sectors are not even generating more employment or anything. Purely on political reasons, some of the sectors are highly protected. Now, this discourages resources moving from these sectors into more efficient export-oriented sectors. Therefore, disparities in effective rate of protection need to be treated. Then you raise this interesting point about FTA. To me, maybe that's a political reason to have an FTA with India or other countries. But economic point of view, free trade zones are simple economic gimmicks. The term FTA, free trade agreement is a misnomer. Every free trade agreement has got rules of origin. That some free trade agreements have 700 page document, right? On the one hand, you give duty concession, but to become eligible for duty concession, they have to meet certain conditions, which are called rules of origin. And many FTAs, rules of origins are draconian, and the admin cost involved in meeting rules of origin is very costly. Therefore, firms completely ignore FTAs. I have done a study about the utilization rate of trade concessions under various FTAs in Thailand, because I have my former PhD student working in the trade ministry, therefore I had access to data. Out of total concessions given under these FTAs, only 10% is utilized. And the exporters ignored other concessions because the admin cost is higher than the benefit they get through these concessions. And then second point is that, do you know electronic trade, which accounts for 40% of world trade, is already duty free because of the ITA agreement. One of the biggest achievements of WTO was signing of the approval of the Information Technology Agreement. All the major trading nations are signatories to Information Technology Agreement. If they are signatories, their trade regimes are duty free. And when I talked to Intel, the recent manager, he laughed, what is FTA? I don't want even to hurt the word because we are in a free trade regime. Right? Then 2 points. The term FTA is a misnomer because there are rules of origin which are costly. Secondly, a big part of world trade, which is electronic trade, is virtually duty free. Therefore, we are wasting human capital, but there can be a political reason. I'm not going to argue against it.
So, Professor Chandra, then if our end objective is to be an attractive place for FDI, particularly export-oriented FDI, and we have a small domestic market, so we're unlikely to get market-seeking FDI, we need to go for a greater openness to trade. What then is your recipe for success if it's not FTAs? If it's not FTAs as the path for trade liberalization, are you then recommending, as Professor Azim Salih sometimes says, a bonfire of protection, complete opening up? Or what path do you suggest if it's not going down the path of FTAs to liberalize trade?
As I mentioned before, Sri Lankan trade regime is much more liberal compared to that in many countries. I would say it's comparable to Malaysia, a country I have written about. We are gone ahead of India, for instance, right? We do not have more than 2 or 3% of import covered by quantitative restriction. Everything is tariff. What is needed is to rationalize the tariff system, right? The people think that higher tariff earn more government revenue, which is not the case. There is evidence to suggest that a more uniform lower tariff system can generate more government revenue, simply because the system becomes much more transparent. When there are cascading tariffs, some high tariff closer to the lower tariff, that provides breeding ground for corruption. Custom officers can shift one item from other. It is happening in Sri Lanka. I have calculated tariff rate across industries. The effective tariff revenue rate is only 1/3 of what is implied by the tariff rate. My colleague, former friend, Sarath Jayatilaka, former custom director, he did an experiment. He realized that there were 2 products where the smuggling is very high. One was floor polishers and vacuum cleaners, then handset telephone. Then on an experimental base, he reduced these duties from 45% to 15%. For a few months, tariff revenue increased 3 times. Because smuggling is not free, right? They have to incur cost in smuggling by paying price to custom officers and all that. If the tariff is low and transparent, they don't have to do this, and then they pay duty. The one country which moved from very cascading duty system to lower 10 to 5% tariff was Chile. After doing that, two things happened. Firstly, tariff revenue increased by threefold. Secondly, the custom system became much more efficient because the corruption is less, you don't have to wait in the queues and all. I strongly recommend rationalizing the tariff structure, moving towards a uniform tariff. It is going to do wonders. FTA can't do that. It will add one more confusion to the tariff structure.
Professor Chandra, I think you alluded earlier to one of the big gripes of investors who had looked at Sri Lanka. And I think we have a question, by the way, the question on FTAs and on the WTO Information Technology Agreement were two things that the audience had sent in. But another one by Sudharan says, why are foreign investors visiting, having a look, and going back with a negative note? And it's happening even now. And I think this links to something some of the other audience members are also asking, including those who sent in questions earlier. Sanjana Hattotua earlier today, because there was a call, I think, for questions earlier on, says, there is often little to no coherence between what the President, Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and other ministers in government say about fiscal policy. How much of a problem is this? And there's another question along similar lines. Policies are changing almost on a daily basis, and conflicting messages appear from within the unity government. How does this affect Sri Lanka's development prospect? So this is popular refrain. I mean, policy inconsistent. We are sure of policy inconsistency nowadays, as sure we are of the sky being blue. So I want to ask you, Professor, you made probably in passing a remark about Vietnam and a reason why Samsung and others went. Now this raises a fairly problematic point for us. We are in a, for all intents and purposes, a democracy, messy right now, coalition government. Difficult to get, push things through with brute force. And then you have Vietnam, pragmatically acknowledged why they need FDI, but completely different political system. So in a context where you said we need to have policy certainty and political stability, where is the way forward for Sri Lanka if we are to attract good quality FDI?
I mean, the only thing I can do is to agree with you, right? Say the last year, 2015, is the year with the lowest level of foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka for 10 years. Policy uncertainty is a factor. I think maybe political leaders know that. I think that it is very important to have a clear-cut policy related to foreign direct investment and restore the role of BOI. BOI in the first 10 years, do you know, before designing BOI, Upali Vijayawardena spent 2 weeks studying Penang Development Corporation. President Premadasa in early 90s spent few days at Penang Development Corporation. Mr. Chet Sin, the retired managing director, now he's 90, he spent a day with me then. He told me that President Premadasa was a visionary. He said, he had one full day interview with him, and then checks in and asks, "Sir, you are very attentive. Can I get my secretary to make notes for him?" Then President Premadasa said, "No, everything is in my mind." Then Mr. Jackson told me, after the interview, he summed up each and every key point. I mean, we need people like him. I'm not a political supporter of Mr. Prema, that's reality. We need to understand how things happen in other countries and then get things rectified. Now I am working with BOI record. The one good thing is they have maintained record about the date when the application is submitted, when it was processed, approved. Some of the time lags are amazing, 2-3 years. Now, simply it happened because under the previous regime, the BOI was denigrated to a secondary position. Decision was made on political ground. Things turned out to be less transparent. If you do not rectify these things, we can't achieve much. I fully agree with you.
Professor Chandra, there are a couple of questions, since you referred to BOI, I want to bring these questions in. A couple of questions on the BOI and the role of the BOI. I think one of them particularly asks about, should the BOI be looking at specific industries, specific product areas to be promoted and pushing Sri Lanka or positioning Sri Lanka, or take a more sector agnostic, pan economy view, in light of what you said about global production networks and whether Sri Lanka can latch on to those, what would your recommendations be on our FDI promotion strategy and what BOI should do?
I can answer this question based on my in-depth study of the Singapore system and system in Penang. Between individual firms, it's not a very good, this is the situation. In both countries, they had a clear-cut investment promotion policy applicable to any enterprise which is coming to the country. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew biography, he says people think Singapore picked up winners, but in reality, I picked up all possible winners. That is a sentence in his book, right? You have to have a transparent policy system where you allow any firms to come. Within that context, actually identifying a particular industry which is more suitable to the country make much sense. Lim Chon Yew, Penang State Minister, Penang was the trouble point in Malaysia. Communist insurgents, 20% unemployment, and so on. They hired a consultancy firm called, old age, I don't remember the name of the consultancy firm. This consultancy firm reported, Nathan report. I have read this report out the cover. They say that for Singapore, it is a tourist attraction. You need to attract industries which meet two criteria. One is clean industry. Secondly, employment industry with employment potential. The only industry which meet both criteria is electronic. If you go to an electronic factory, you can't see a peck of dust in the factory, right? It has to be a pristine factory. Now, then Lim Chon Yew and Chet Sin, they focus their investment promotion on electronic industry without ignoring other industries. Remember, with all the electronic trade, some shirt producing companies are there in Penang, right? They are allowed, incentives are equally given, but they focus on an industry which is suitable for the country. I think in Sri Lanka, by talking to various firms, my feeling is that part and component assembly within electrical and electronic trade has a lot of potential in Sri Lanka. The existing firms are doing well. I interviewed one gentleman called Mr. Rohan Pallewatte, Lanka Harnesses. He is producing the trigger and harnesses for Toyota airbag. Toyota has become very happy about him. They have given him a certificate. Based on that certificate, he is producing for Lamborghini and with other companies. And Detroit companies invited him to set up a plant in Mexico because Sri Lanka is a little bit further. They can do the production from there. I think this sector, we have talents and we can do a lot. And what is needed is to tell these success stories and use these people in the investment promotion campaign. Earlier in BOI election investment promotion campaign were led by mostly lawyers. They went to Japan and other places just for the trip, not to promote the industry. And in Penang, when Lim Chon Yu organized election, promotion campaign, always managers of companies from that countries were hired as part of the mission. When they went to Germany to promote investment, Ostrom manager who was in Penang led the investment promotion campaign. When Ostrom manager goes to Germany and speak in German and tell how good place is Penang, naturally investors are convinced. Now we have to use successful businessmen as part of our investment promotion campaign, not politicians and lawyers. That's what I feel.
Understand it because, for instance, Rohan Palawat's firm has a 1 part per million defect rate. I want to, since it's getting late, I also want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions verbally. There's a mic going around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I have to ask you one question before that, Professor, so please raise your hand and the mic will come to you. On Slido, one of the most popular questions is this. It might be unfair to put it to you if you don't know the tea industry well enough, but the question is, there was some controversy over opening up the tea industry in Sri Lanka for blending. Should we hold on to the Ceylon tea brand or go for a more globalized approach? So you may know that some firms are in favor of liberalizing so that Sri Lanka becomes a tea blending hub. Others feel that that will dilute the premium nature of Ceylon tea brand. The reality also is that some of those firms that are opposing it are in fact doing blending in other countries, and the value is not getting captured here. So on this specific question, I don't know how much work you've done on tea, but I think I owe it to the audience, particularly Ajit Fernando has sent in this question and it's top of the popular list, and I have to pose it to you. What are your thoughts on liberalizing tea blending in Sri Lanka?
It's a very interesting question. Again, I was involved in supervising PhD student also on this issue. Now, I have talked to my neighbor in my suburb in Canberra, Redhill, right? All of them buy Dilma. They buy Dilma not because it's Sri Lankan tea, believe me. Actually, they realize that it's a Sri Lankan tea when I told them about it. They buy Dilma because of the nice production, packaging, sales promotion and all that, right? In other words, there are two types of tea bags. Say, some connoisseur of tea, they may look for specifically Sri Lankan produced tea, but that market is very tiny. Tea bag market is the biggest. Now, in the tea bag market, a company cannot be competitive only by using high quality Sri Lankan tea. Blending is a must to be competitive. Can I give you an example? Again, I learned it through interview with Tata economist research. Tata wanted to get into world tea bag industry. Therefore, they bought Twinning, a company located with then they came, Tata even bought tea plantations in Sri Lanka. Now, Twinning tea bags, do you know where Twinning tea bags are produced? They are produced in China, not in Sri Lanka, because they cannot produce competitive tea bags using only high quality tea, and there are restrictions on importing low quality tea to blend with it. Therefore, they have located their assembly plant in China. we have lost employment and lot of things because of that. The view that opening local-to import will destroy our industry, I don't believe in it. If you want to be competitive, I think in tea bag industry you have to blend tea. That's my answer.
Okay, I'm going to open up to the audience for maybe three questions, and I ask you very sincerely to please keep it brief. We only have one speaker, so no mini speeches, please. I don't mean to be rude. Very short questions so that we can take as many as possible. Firstly, the gentleman with the mic, the gentleman next, the gentleman in front of you, and then
Mr. Chairman.
at the back. Yes, go ahead.
Very sharp and very short. Professor, of course, was my teacher, and he was my classmate too. That explains the age, the older student. I have a specific question because we are fresh from this 1 million job thing which happened last week. This relates to producer-driven GPN and value chains. Two examples. Back in 14, I wrote a small article, insignificant, obscure. Somebody commented, but that was repeated early this year by the Honorable, the Excellency, the Ambassador for Japan. He said that we should look at seriously relocating parts of this value chain activities in the country, because Japan and Japanese managers prefer Sri Lanka to India. So that was a statement made by the ambassador, not me. So I want your opinion. How feasible, how realistic is this? That we can attract, despite our disadvantages, attract Japanese automobile. Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a few more together. Professor, you prefer to answer directly? Okay, sure.
Very good to listen to you. We have been batchmates at Peradeniya, right? But I think I'm older than you.
Train economics.
Now, I think if the investment regime become more transparent, Japanese will come. Out of the 30 companies I have studied, 20 are Japanese companies. They are very happy about Sri Lankan operations. And again, maybe the message hasn't gone to many others. Say, I think BOI, when they promote investment, some of the successful manufacturers, they have to engage them in the promotion campaign. I think Japanese investors will come to Sri Lanka. Then another one point, the robotization, I forgot, it is related to your topic. Say, the type of activities undertaken by part and component assemblers in Sri Lanka cannot be robotized. This is the point, right? Say the trigger in Toyota airbag or anything, robot can't make it. Human hand has to be there to make it. Some of the harnesses and all that. I look at production structures of these firms. I have summarized it in my thing. All these things I have checked with some production engineer. My son is also a production engineer. These activities cannot be robotized. Robotization, say Rohan Palewatan told me that when he visited Nagoya factory, it is the most robotized factory in the world. But he saw that in one corner, a lot of Japanese are sitting and doing these little activities. Then he talked to the manager and said, why can't you allow me to do it in Sri Lanka at a very low cost? Then the manager has said that this is the most sensitive part in an automobile. We accept only 1/1,000,000 defect rate. Then Palewatu proved that he can make that requirement, and then Toyota allowed him to do that. I think these success stories tell me that robotization is not going to affect. We have ability to expand these activities. I think you can tell your minister to focus on that industry, not on a firm, but in that industry. I can provide some input if you want.
Professor, I'm also one of your students. So I'm asking a question related to what you presented today. You very clearly showed that Sri Lankan export promotion has really led to attracting more customer-oriented networks rather than producer-oriented networks. So, what are our current competitive strengths to attract producer networks? And also, what are the policy changes the government needs to do immediately to reverse the situation and start attracting?
Yeah. Again, I think my previous question answer also related. Now, the point I made is that when we open up the economy, we had opportunities in both areas. I mean, that's why Motorola came. That is the subject of that Harvard Business Review article, right? Everybody expected Sri Lanka to become an electronic hub. We lost that opportunity because of policy uncertainty and other things. Then the way to regain the lost dream would be to reform, right? And then in the investment promotion campaign, we need to focus more on our capabilities in this area. Again, robotization is an unnecessary fear. There are activities which cannot be robotized. And again, sometimes imagine what happened in garment industry happened in this area. There would have been some Sri Lankan multinationals. In Penang, there were no Malay multinationals. There are now more than 15 Malay multinationals which have come out of producer-driven production network activity. Finally, this is the area which is growing very fast. Say Australia is a high-wage country, therefore many things manufacturing cannot thrive. But in producer-driven production network, some of the items can be skill-intensive. And Australian companies are doing very well. Now, automotive industry is gone because Australia cannot produce cars competitively in the tiny market and all that. But there are companies producing very high-tech component of the car engine and exporting to Germany. Now, I'm not saying that when you get into this activity, we are going to be locked in at a lower bound. Things can improve over time, and the government can play a role in providing, the technical education and all that. And again, we don't have to wait until Nobel Prize winning engineers are produced in the country. We have talents. Labor scarcity and lack of skill is exaggerated. People who do not know what is happening in the world.
Okay. Funny, sir.
Once in 5 years, how can we reform as far as liberalization is concerned? Number two is when we reduce duties, we come into a BOP crisis. It happened in 2010-11, it happened now. We are eating into our foreign reserves. So how do we strike a balance?
The first question, I think, frankly, I can't understand, right? But if the institutions, mechanisms are set up nicely, law and order is restored, sometimes the government change may not affect the policy continuity. Actually, some of the elements of the original reform have been continuing because of the bipartisan support for export promotion, right? Like free trade zone situation for export-oriented firms, I think it has continued. I think we need bold reform which should be durable. Now, your second question. No, this point, this is an empirical issue. Somebody has to study it. The higher variable import duties lead to higher government revenue has been contested. There is evidence that suggests a more uniform tariff structure can lead to two things. More tariff revenue, secondly, a more efficient custom administration. This is an issue Sri Lankan policymakers need to study. I can give you evidence from other countries, particularly the Chilean experience has been very widely written. Reduction of tariff making uniformity, increase tariff revenue 3 times, reducing room for corruption. And then custom system became efficient. This is a hypothesis from my part. I haven't studied Sri Lankan case. It is worth studying. Actually, it can be a topic for a PhD thesis.
So we increased our revenue, but we had a BOP crisis in 2011.
Yeah.
We reduced tariffs.
No. Again, when you look at inter-industry differences in tariff rate, I have seen I can't see that revenue increase to the extent that tariff rates are increased.
And I think it's important to recognize that the tariff reductions were on a small subset of items as opposed to across the board. And it's those that then you saw huge influx of items and affecting BOP. We have time for maybe one more question. Abhita, I'm keen to end. Dana, do we have 5 minutes to end by 8? Abhita, over to you.
Yep. Hi, Professor. The question, you're talking about liberalization, foreign direct investment, and I'm surprised no one touched on the topic. The hot topic is EDCA. And I know you mentioned that trade tariffs is what needs to be straightened out and not free trade agreements. And why is everyone pushing for EDCA, and what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, so since your the medicine almost professor was across the board tariff reductions, his question was then why all this, why EDCA and why this excitement over EDCA?
I think that's an important question to be studied and educate the policymakers about various, there are no hard and fast answers, right? You have to look at both limitations and advantages. According to my study of the literature and my empirical work, I believe that uniform tariffs, low tariff structure has advantages. Maybe policymakers don't believe in it because they are wedded to old ideas. When the former tariff commission was working, actually I sent a note with examples. And, but they did not listen to it. I found very interesting example, especially with production fragmentation. Companies can use the fragmentation to avoid taxation, right? Again, Sarath Jatalka, my former friend, the director, told me a story. A company assembling sewing machine in this country, and the import duty on a sewing machine was 45%, right? Then company, what they did was to broke the machine into 5 components and brought in 5 boxes. When built, the component tariff is 5%.
Professor, sorry, my question is, what's your opinion on EDCA? On the trade agreement. On the trade agreement that they're trying to push forward, the EDCA agreement.
Frankly, I thought you were asking about the tariff issue. I said it. Now, the general question, my answer is that I have not studied this particular agreement, right? But I have studied FTAs in many other countries. What I have found is that the term FTA or free trade agreement does not tell the full story, right? The utilization rate of many FTAs is very low because of the rules of origin complications. I need to look at the rules of origin complications to tell you the story. Just look at what they are, right? Now, I can tell you one story. On my trip here, I was sitting next to a producer of joystick, Andupur, located in Mavanal, and then they are employing 600 workers, import some of the, I think the fragrant part or something from India. Now, they are not exempted from duties. The Indian agreement has been very selective. The industries which they want to promote are protected through high rules of origin, or they are exempted from other areas. Therefore, it is not a very transparent and clear FTA. Therefore, if you look at item by item, you might find that FTA or free trade agreement is a misnomer. Yeah.
Professor Chandra, I want to close with posing a question to you, given the work that you've done on Penang. There was a lot of excitement about Hambantota earlier, in the earlier regime, for obvious reasons. There's now renewed interest in Hambantota to actually this time see what can we do with all this stuff that's been built. The Chinese are interested and so on. Ravin and I once, I think, wrote something about how to make Hambantota work. I want to pose the question to you. If you had to pin it down to 2 to 3 ingredients that the government should look at as lessons learned from Penang, as an export hub in Penang, to make Hambantota an export hub and truly make it work, not just ad hoc investors here and there, what would your recipe for success be? 2 to 3 points based on what you've seen in Penang.
Yeah. Again, it's a difficult question. Perhaps I can send you a note after studying the Hambantota area and all that. But in Penang, yeah. Yeah. Say, one of there are many things which led to the success of Penang case. The Penang Development Corporation was set up by Penang government. It is studied as a model by other countries. Perhaps you can look at how Penang Development Corporation is operating. It's a semi-autonomous corporation, and earlier they had a problem of lack of money because the central government, dominated by the Bumiputra, didn't want to support Penang, which is a state government run by the Chinese. Then they devised one very effective thing. They started the land bank. They developed their own land, purchased paddy fields and others, and developed a land bank. Maybe that is a lesson, right? Then renting land has become the biggest revenue source for Penang Development Corporation. Therefore, it became self-sufficient. Without listening to KL, they could implement their policy. And there was a very strong team. The Lim Chong Yu and the state minister worked very well. Again, their investment promotion campaign never ended the time when the investor come to the country. That was only one part of the story. Every month, Lim Chong Yu or his senior people visited these factories and identified their problems and solved these issues immediately. In other words, investment promotion has been a perpetual thing. It is not just bringing the investor. You won't believe that when I told stories about these electronic firms, actually BOI people, they didn't know about it. I had to introduce Rohan Pallava to these people, the visionary investor. They approved the firm, but they didn't know what this firm is doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I think you've given us a lot to think about, both in terms of policies and also institutions. I think there are a few questions that we couldn't quite really deep dive into given the nature of the session. I think sure, and Professor Chandra invites you to send an email to him if you have any clarification. I think your presentation threw up a few interesting areas that we need to dig in further. We have this idea around value addition, and a lot of people say, Sri Lanka should move, quote unquote, further up the value chain. And that gives you the idea that we should do more of taking one item from its most basic state to its most sophisticated state within country. So I think some of what you said has strong implications to bust that idea where you can be part of a high-tech production network without actually necessarily waiting for you to have all the top engineers or even doing all of it in your country. And I think you also, and these are conversations we've had before, where you said Sri Lanka having a lack of labor and talent may not necessarily be entirely true. There are firms producing for Japan, producing for some of the bigger companies around the world that haven't left Sri Lanka on account of either higher wages or poor talent. So I think that's something again to think about implications from your presentation. So thank you very much, Professor, for that presentation. Thank you for the great questions from the audience and for your interaction. Always a session like this ends with more questions than answers, but I think it's time for all of us to push on the questions, for instance, what Abhita raised, trade liberalization in general versus some of these trade agreements. What is our role in shaping the future economy? And it's great that new institutions like Advocata have come forward to reshape that narrative, truly looking at Sri Lanka as a dynamic global city that's open for business, that's open for people. And congratulations to the team, to the team at Advocata. Dana, over to you.
Thank you.